Welcome, everyone. I see that this is session 5 in the conference, and this is the second session for this morning. It's a session on multilingualism. My name is Zachary Sung. I'm professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature here at Brown, and I have the great honor of moderating this panel and introducing our speakers. And as you know, we're keeping the introductions short, so I'm not going to do biographies for everyone. You'll find more information on the website for the conference. I'm just going to introduce each speaker very briefly and tell you what the title of their talk is, and then hand the mics over to our guests for today. So our first speaker is Steve Thorne from the Department of World Languages and Literatures at Portland State University and the Applied Linguistics Department at the University of Groningen. And the title of Steve Thorne's talk today is going to be Phenotypic and Categorical Complexities of Language.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your attention today. Thank you, Jane, for the invitation. Thank you to presenters who've come before me. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm an exogenous member of this community. I am completely not a translator, although I would like to say that in 1989, I translated, we believe for the first time, a short story written in Kashike Bhojpuri, which is an Eastern UP or Uttar Pradesh variety of Hindi, Bihari kind of mixed that's local to that region. But that is it. Otherwise, I am not a translator. And I thought today, because of the title of the talk, Multilingualism, that we would actually break down in kind of a two-part talk some issues, problems, but also some potential candidate solutions to the terminological conundrum that we have in linguistics, but also that is one that I think many translators could resonate with. And then I'm going to talk, with permission from Jane, about a brief empirical project. Yes, you will see a histogram, but it will be in an interesting context, I hope. All right, and I can also do an exegesis of the title if there's an interest, but I won't do that now. So there's a strong argument made by some in the field of linguistics that linguistics, in fact, does not need to postulate the existence of languages as part of its theoretical apparatus. And it's an interesting proposition, right? Language, as you would well know, is a noun. And what we do is typically communicative activity, so it's more of a verb. And so the problem, as I'll discuss in just a minute, is this direction of fit in the work of John Searle. What we do know is that there are two temporal dimensions for understanding communicative activity. One is what's called first-order languaging by some in the field, which is the real-time production of communicative actions in the process ontology of the unfolding moment. And there's a second and very important dimension called second-order language, which is a little bit more categorical, less a process, although it is a process, just more glacial, where you have sedimented social practices and semiotic assemblages evolving over longer timescales that, in fact, constrain but also enable the first-order languaging activity in real time, right? As John Searle has argued in philosophy and related to other topics, the problem we have in the language-related fields, including linguistics, possibly translation, is that we don't have a necessarily tight word-to-world direction of fit, because the idea of language does not necessarily encompass the heterogeneity and the dynamicity of the real-time production of communicative action. And I understand many of you work, of course, in the literary area, and there are residua of the real-time production of language in the form of written text, for example, and earlier inscriptions and other things like this. Okay, so this actually has a pretty long history in 20th century linguistics, which I'm not going to talk about at length, but Ferdinand de Saussure, the kind of progenitor of what became structuralism that manifested across many, many fields, including anthropology and linguistics, sociology, emphasized the idea of the systematicity and the kind of regulatory relational identity of synchronous, homogeneous notions of language, at the cost, really, of the focus on parole, which was everyday use. This was strengthened, in fact, in the work of Leonard Bloomfield, immediate constituency analysis, et cetera, who almost removed entirely meaning or semantics from linguistics in the 1930s and 40s. And of course, in the more contemporary field, we have grammaticality judgments as the primary focus of data and understanding of language and its relationship to mind and communication, through the work of Noam Chomsky, which he called competence. And he was really quite uninterested in performance, as he described it, which is the actual use of language for some sort of communicative purpose. And these aren't wrong, mind you. These are just attendant outgrowths of this kind of theoretical framing and this salience hierarchy of what's important. And part of this was simply making the complex, messy dynamics of everyday communicative activity a scientific object that could be studied, right? Which the slipperiness of everyday communicative action is more difficult to get at. So this idea of language as an abstract system, structure more important than use or practice, language stability is more important than language change, and in all of these, there's a homogeneous conception of fundamentally a kind of displaced form of language, this frozen notion of language. So there's been quite a lot of contestation about this in the field. There's a lot of work that many of you know better than I that come from the southernizing or global south. For example, my colleagues are Sintry Makoni from Zimbabwe originally. We worked together at Penn State for about a decade. But he and Alistair Pennycook published a very seminal piece in 2007 talking about the historical invention of discrete or named languages. Other scholars have talked about this as well, of course, and they talked about the meta-discursive regimes that were actually much earlier than the 20th century forms of colonialism and scholarship that actually produced this notion of a named language. And as Makoni has described it, himself focusing mostly on sociolinguistics on the continent of Africa, named languages are invented in desperate search of speakers. And we all know, and this is an everyday kind of thing, that language itself is not a scientific descriptor. It's a political descriptor. So we have nation states associated with national languages, for example, and we know that languages that were one thing, say English, prior to the 7th or 8th century, became something very else, very different when the Ingvanic varieties from the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes got influenced by Old Norse and eventually the Norman Conquest, resulting in a 60% lexical overlay within English, a Germanic language that is actually Latinate. So these kinds of things happen in language, and many of the ways in which we talk about the historical constructions of languages kind of freeze these, right? So what are some candidate terminological and conceptual options that may improve this word-to-world direction of fit? And there aren't any. I'm just happy to say there aren't any. But multilingualism, this is from the EU, right? That is the edict or systemic perspective, the presence of multiple languages in society, whereas plurilingualism, which is used very widely in the EU, as most of you know, is an individual's experience with or use of multiple languages, so an emic or participant relative perspective on multiple semiotic repertoires, right? Both terms are critiqued for still positing or endorsing the idea that you have discrete and stable and hermetically bounded linguistic repertoires that we've called languages. Another comes from the sociolinguistics of globalization, also called sometimes critical sociolinguistics. And there are a couple of problematizations in this field. The conception of languages as bounded systems linked to bounded communities is one. The problematization, two, is multilingualism as monolingual pluralization, multiple named languages as discrete entities. And the suggestion here, and there is a suggestion, not necessarily vis-a-vis nomenclature, but in terms of approach, is a paradigm shift in the study of language and society that moves from presumptions of homogeneity, stability, and boundedness, and toward mobility, mixing, an appreciation of the historical and political dynamics that actually shape these communicative repertoires as we begin thinking about the categorical identity of these rather than their processual or process ontology identity. Yeah? Okay. And a last slide on this kind of stuff. Code switching, which has been simply defined as communication using resources from discrete named languages. So English, Hindi, right, for example, or Spanish, English, or what have you. Translanguaging is a slightly different move, and this was talked about very eloquently yesterday by a number of colleagues. A speaker's construction of a linguistic repertoire without necessarily positing a diglossic functional separation of that linguistic repertoire into discrete named languages. It's an interesting conceptual move, right? And there does seem to be, for some communities, some cognitive neuroscience support for the fact that you may not have actually a kind of differentiation between the resource, cognitive resources, circuits of neural activation associated with some of these what might be called mixed or complex meshed systems of communication. The last is by Jorgensen, polylanguaging, and this has been applied mostly to the intentional use of multiple languages that may not typically be found in use together, so not code switching necessarily, somewhat more aligned with this more intentional agentive notion of translanguaging. So I hope you're dissatisfied, I certainly am. There isn't a really good solution to fixing the problem of word-to-world fit, but I would like to say humans are linguistically mediated beings, and it really isn't about language. It is about people. And language itself is, as I quote Victor Ingv here, language is not a thing that leads a life of its own outside and above human beings. And of course, Raymond Williams, the Marxist literary theorist and critic, definition of language is always implicitly or explicitly a definition of human beings in the world, right? It's the people, and it's the valuation of languages, which we come to now. So we're leaving aside this terminological discussion, brief as it was, and as unsatisfactory as it was. This is an article by Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, bringing race into second language acquisition. And I'm only going to mention one small thing about this. I'll talk about ratiolinguistics very briefly in a minute. There are other members of the panel here who are more versed in this. But it is how bilingualism is understood and treated. And if you're a kid in the United States growing up in a Latinx family, you're expected to be bilingual if you're in the public education system, right? So here you have Prince Charlotte, a royal, right, being described by journalists as being bilingual, a skill most people cannot claim. And the author herself describes herself as can't help but feeling inferior to this 3-year-old who's learning Spanish and English at the same time. A completely unremarkable feat, by the way, absolutely unremarkable. So as described here, and I'm going to have to go a little quickly, is fundamentally this idea of how race, ethnicity, and social valuation invokes the relevance of linguistic bias for certain communities, but not others. And we have a project at my university, and the project is working with OGDI, the Office of Global Diversity and Inclusion, and you can see the protected categories here. All right, racism, homophobia, sexism, ableism, and I'm very happy to see classism. We all know class doesn't exist in the United States, only elsewhere. So it's good that that's mentioned. There is nothing about language, and there is nothing about linguistic diversity on our university's website, although all other demographics are there, first-gen college students, et cetera, right? So this idea of informing this project, this LIDA project, language, diversity, and sorry, this is right in my way here. Diversity and discrimination project, sorry, is informed by ratiolinguistics and language as the last acceptable bias, right, which has been written about in the linguistics literature. So I am going to go very quickly now, forgive me. We are doing interventions. We have a linguistics roadshow, which is public facing. So we have people watching, say, nature videos with narration, and you expect David Attenborough, and goodness, they choose voices that sound like David Attenborough rather than, say, varieties from the US South. for example. We also distributed a large survey, and we're interviewing faculty and students. The survey was distributed. We actually got a 9% response rate, which doesn't sound like too much unless you do this kind of work. 2,216 responses. I'll talk only about a couple of things here, and this is obviously a subset of the faculty and staff and students at PSU, but you have a significant number of multilinguals here, and I'm stopping. We have a bunch of first languages, and I'll say just this last thing. So if you look at power, so undergraduates are in the most vulnerable situation, grad students next, staff and faculty, and you look at responses to this question, I'll be more successful if I use standard English, and you see that, in fact, the most vulnerable in our population have that understanding. And similarly, non-binary respondents report feeling more frequent pressure to change their language when they're at university. I felt pressure to change my language in PSU context, and you have male, female, and non-binary or genderqueer individuals stating that they feel that most strongly. All right, I am going to stop, but our hope is that we add linguistic discrimination to our list of other protected categories in this institutional context of higher education. I'm quite confident that Brown also doesn't have this. Most universities don't. I think this is quite important. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. Our second speaker in the panel is Paja Fodri, my colleague from the Anthropology Department at Brown University. The title of Paja's talk is Fake Authors, with the word fake in scare quotes, Fake Authors and Activist Translators, Indigenous Authorship in the Digital Age. Please welcome Paja.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me? Okay? Okay, great. So I want to start just by thanking everybody who made this possible, Jane in particular. I also just want to enter a note of excitement. Translation is really central to my work. I do ethnographic and engaged scholarship with speakers of indigenous languages. I also do work on indigenous language documents, mostly from the colonial era. So I study translation as a practice. I work with translators. I do translations myself, but this is the first time I've been to a translation conference. And so the first time I've had a chance to speak at such length with other people who pay so much attention to translation. So I'm really delighted to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is indigenous language in Mexico and the central role that translation and translators play in that, and as well as the resistance to translation, what people choose not to translate. Given the interdisciplinary audience, I'm really going to leave aside my sort of theoretical commitments. Happy to talk about them later, except hint is I love Bakhtin. Happy to talk about Bakhtin at any point. And just a note on the image, which I hope to get to at the end. Some of you who know anything about ancient Mesoamerican writing will recognize the iconography from early Mesoamerican writing that has been kind of updated, I suppose, for the digital age. Let me just briefly give you a sort of overview of the kind of parts of the talk that I hope to get through today. So an overview of indigenous authorship in Mexico, some of the underlying ideologies that are sort of often, not very often made explicit, but I'm going to make them explicit, and how that relates to what I've sometimes called weighted bilingualism, and then some of the messy and subversive realities that I think are really what's most interesting about indigenous authorship, which is it actually doesn't conform to the ideologies that people espouse about it. And then finally, if there's time, digital activism. So some new research I'm doing with self-identified digital activists, but also how the affordances of online media and some of the things that people are doing to promote indigenous authorship is adding even more complexities to what indigenous authorship can and is today in Mexico. So to give you a sort of, so this is something I've talked about a lot, I've written about a lot, sort of indigenous authorship in Mexico, focusing in particular on literary authors, poets, playwrights to some extent, songwriters. To give you a little bit more of a background, so I really hate maps like this, but I'm going to use them anyway for just a minute. So the important context is that Mexico is an incredibly linguistically diverse place. This map sort of suggests some of that to you. Officially in Mexico, there are 68 agrupaciones lingüísticas, linguistic groupings with 364 variants. And as you can see, they're concentrated in particular in the south, the southern part of Mexico, in particular this state, Oaxaca, which is where most of my research is based. This suggests the different linguistic groupings. The different languages, there are 15 something spoken here. The lived reality for both of these places is much more complex. So to sort of embrace the quote from Max Weinreich for just a minute, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. These distinctions are all thoroughly political, only sometimes recognized as such by people who use these kinds of maps. And also bilinguals are not represented at all in maps like this. Not just people who speak indigenous languages and Spanish, but people who speak multiple indigenous languages, a point that I'll come back to a little bit later. A little bit of a sort of more of an overview of indigenous authorship in Mexico. It's kind of part of a broader project of linguistic and cultural activism, language reclamation and revival. And it's represented in almost every language, both in part because they're grassroots efforts as such to sort of produce text, literary texts in particular indigenous languages, but also there's a lot of state support. So as a part of the state-supported multiculturalism, you kind of need to collect the whole set in some sense. It's really important to have representation from indigenous groups, from every linguistic group. So in this context, the kind of gold standard is bilingual editions like this, both in sort of print and also online, that have sort of speak to both online and print physical versions. You have this standard output, which is Spanish, indigenous language, bilingual editions on facing pages. And it's incredibly common, both sort of online and in physical editions. But editions like this, which are to say only in indigenous languages, are extremely rare. They tend to be, as this sort of quality of this particular text would suggest, not supported by the state, very locally oriented, et cetera. It is worth pointing out that for things like this, authors are both the writers, but also the translators of their own work. So I literally do not know somebody who translates indigenous writing that's not themselves writing their own work. So if you don't have somebody else doing your translation, you're doing your own translations. A side note, it also means that authors are also agents of orthographic standardization, which is a whole other conversation, but most of these languages have a really recent history of modern writing, which is to say using Latin alphabets, et cetera, and most orthographies are not standardized. So a big part of being an indigenous author is also always sort of promoting indigenous orthography, or not in some rare cases, which is really, really interesting. So some of the underlying ideologies underneath this way of looking at writing are kind of laid bare by this particular quote by a well-known Zapotec poet from the Isthmus of Oaxaca. This was at a writers' conference, so he's speaking to other writers. It was later published widely online. I know we've got lots of Spanish speakers in the audience, so I'm not going to read it, but I am going to sort of translate it a little bit on the fly. So and I can't even read it, some unnumbered, it's blocked. So a countless number of writers in indigenous languages pretend to write in their mother tongues for the purposes of acquiring grants and prizes. These dishonest authors, am I hearing feedback? Am I hearing feedback? Oh, anyway, okay, I'm gonna keep, I just thought I was hearing feedback. Okay, these dishonest writers are agents of the destruction of our languages. Who are these opportunistic writers? Those that write in Spanish, write their works first in Spanish, and then translate them with help or not into the indigenous languages. If I am not mistaken, more than 50% of those who claim to be indigenous authors are frauds or fakes, right? So what are some of the underlying ideologies that this guy is making explicit for just a minute? For the first thing, that indigenous language versions should be first and primary, right? You should always write in the indigenous language first, and that any other model of indigenous authorship is really fraudulent. That writing and speaking are treated as the same thing, right? So there should be a sort of one-to-one correspondence between how people speak and how they write, sort of no real engagement with the fact that writing and speaking are really different realities, really different skills, and certainly in indigenous languages, the number of people who read or write in indigenous language is very different from the number of people who speak in it, and that languages should be compartmentalized, right? They shouldn't be sort of, there should be this sort of like clearly bimodal process by which you write in one language and then you translate it into the other. And I would say, note, however, that the fact that this quote was originally delivered and later published in Spanish, that was the language it was given in. So the very fact that he is writing and speaking in Spanish already speaks to some of the internal contradictions of this sort of process, right, of being an Indigenous author, which is to say he was speaking to other Indigenous authors, most of whom do not speak not just his language, Zapotec. So Zapotec has 500,000 speakers. There are 4 different major variants. From some accounting, there's 50-something mutually unintelligible variants. So even other Zapotec authors often don't speak the same variant that he does. So most of the people speaking to don't speak the same language he does, therefore the necessity of Spanish. It gets, so I may get to this at the end, but let me say a little bit more about the kind of notion of weighted bilingualism. The realities get even more complicated surrounding the importance of Spanish when you think about, for example, the way Indigenous language texts are consumed. So most people who read Indigenous language poetry, say, most of them don't speak the same language as the authors, so they're reading it mostly in Spanish. So the Spanish is actually the language in which they access the text. And even people who speak Indigenous languages, this is based on a lot of ethnographic research I did, don't engage with the Indigenous language in isolation. They're using the Spanish version heavily to interpret and decode the Indigenous language, because although they speak it fluently, their practices, their habits of writing and reading, the literate world around them, the world of text, is like a sea of Spanish, where these little islands of Indigenous languages, right? So texting, writing emails, reading stuff on television screens, reading newspapers, reading stuff online, that's all overwhelmingly done in Spanish. So they use the Spanish and their heavy fluency as writers and readers of Spanish, even if their first language is in English, they use the Spanish to kind of decode and match the written version of the language, of the Indigenous language, to their understanding of it as speakers, right? Which makes first of all, it sort of asks all kinds of questions about what the text is, right? I mean, here I would say the text is really this kind of like bilingual synthetic version that's both things together. So that's one of the messy realities. The other is sort of like the world in which authors write, right, and work, which is that even if symbolically the most important audience is other speakers, other readers of speakers of Indigenous language who are reading their work, as would be suggested by the conference in which Victor Turan spoke, most of the authors that people speak to, most of the audience are other authors, other Indigenous authors. So the criticism, the feedback, the people who are engaging most deeply with their work are mostly also speakers of Indigenous languages, even if, or also doing so through Spanish, even if they are themselves speakers of Indigenous languages. So that's kind of the context. To sort of get to a couple of really interesting ways that people kind of mess with this, and I'll give just 3 quick examples. So there was a case. So Mexico has these prizes for Indigenous authors, and there was a case a few years ago where the author who won, who was a Zapotec author, I'm not going to say any more than that because I don't want to out him, submitted the Spanish version, which is what you have to do when you submit, and he won the prize. And then they were like, "Okay, you have to submit the Indigenous language version." And he kept not submitting it and not submitting it and not submitting it. And finally, they had to give him a hard deadline. It was like, "You have to submit this version, or we're going to yank the prize," right? And talking to him and other people, he hadn't done the translation yet. So he did exactly what Victor Turan said you shouldn't do, which is write in the Indigenous language first. Even though if you think about this context where he knew who the audience was, and even if you have a thought, say, in Indigenous language, and an idea in Indigenous language, which you were so heavily used to writing in Spanish first, is utterly unsurprising that he might have that approach to how we would write. That's one example. The other, briefly, I've been to many, many readings where what people will do when they're doing a bilingual reading, they will read one text in Indigenous language, one text in Spanish, and it's presented as though these 2 versions are 2 versions of the same poem. But the reality is they often don't do that. People will often read a poem that is denotationally completely different from the Spanish version. And I can speculate on why they might be doing that, kind of marking who is and isn't part of the in-group. In some cases, sort of like highlighting how much more impoverished Spanish is than the Indigenous language version. I mean, there are all kinds of different ways that you can think about what they're doing, but the point is the reality is much more complicated than just you write a text in an Indigenous language and here goes the Spanish version. Finally, there are people who very explicitly do that, who explicitly translate the Spanish version to make the Spanish version a kind of foil for the beauty of the Indigenous language. So they purposefully kind of like under-translate or skew their translations in Spanish to make them seem dull, uninteresting, impoverished next to the indigenous language, right? That is kind of the actual reality of what indigenous language authorship actually looks like. I don't have time to talk about this, but if you sort of match this up with some really interesting things that people are doing online and the kind of visual media that kind of allows you to kind of circumvent Spanish entirely, then there's a whole new realm of sort of possibilities. So briefly to translate, this one is Anani Kautenek, Anya Intijaba. I speak Tenek or Wastek as it is sometimes translated, and I am not ashamed, right? Using this kind of I love sandcastles meme where there's the remnants of the little sandcastle is crushed in his little hand. And then finally, I'll just close with this one image, which is from this group of Mije writers called Colmix, sort of a pun on Colmex, if you know sort of this famous Mexican university, sort of Colegio de Mije. Mije is an indigenous language spoken in Mexico. And so they're taking these two really different emojis and sort of glossing them into Mije in ways that sort of highlight how similar they are, right? I mean, so these kind of like humorous ways of sort of engaging with the language that also completely circumvents Spanish and allow you to sort of not deal with Spanish at all is kind of interesting. And this is a whole other thing that I've written about a whole lot, which is online music, which I'm not going to talk about since I am out of time. So let me just close by saying thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Baja. Our third speaker in the panel is Joe Dupree from the Native and Indigenous Studies program at Brown. And the title of the talk today that he's going to share with us is Creative Works and Accountability. Thank you.
Waglisat, Gausas is Leche Justan Skik, Nimbos Sausknige, Ersknage, Moat Aknage, Big Pine Numa Ange, Mindakoj Lakota Ange. It's nice to meet you all. Thank you for coming and listening. My name is Joseph Dupree. I'm from Chiloquin, Oregon. To give you a brief area of where I'm at in the world, I'm from the Klamath tribes. That's Klamath, Modoc, and Yehuskin from Southern Oregon. I'm from Chiloquin. It's a small town of 600. I've been engaged in language revitalization, reclamation, and linguistics for about a little over 10 years now. And so moving from linguistics and working with my community, translation always keeps coming up. And it's one of those issues where we have to figure out, what do you mean by that all the time? And then when it comes to the sort of language reclamation projects and how to get our language back out there into the community, we have to get the whole world on this small part of the area that's not actually that small. If you look in the orange, that's our traditional territory. And that is not a small place where Klamath, Modoc, and Paiute languages are all spoken, right? Now, the story I'm about to share is the first project that I've done that's not focused on working with my tribal government, right? And so normally I try to work with my tribal government because I think that tribally driven research is a way that we can protect our inherent rights to self-determination through language, right? To give you a little bit of my standing. I'm going to talk about this time that we had a police action against eviction resistors raised into the term of a war that most people would recognize as the Modoc War that resulted in 4 of our leaders being publicly executed in front of us, 2 imprisoned at Alcatraz, and the rest sent to Oklahoma in one of the longest instances of forced removal in our history, right? So this is about that. And talking about a way that doesn't make a feature film make us seem like cheesy bad guys with terrible accents. So if you ever had a chance to see Drumbeat, you've heard of the Modoc War. If you've seen Escort West, it's been alluded to in that by another set of renegade Modocs that don't exist, right? And so these are 2 feature films. Like these are, you can look at them on YouTube, and like I do them while I'm on the treadmill, and they are just goofy. The way the natives talk, the things that they say, the names that they have nothing to do with our people, have nothing to do with anything, right? But I was brought on to this project called This Is Their Land by 2 Modoc consultants from my community. That's Taylor Tupper and Deborah Riddle. They were working with Michael O'Leary, a non-Indigenous student from California State, Northridge, and he was one of 4 people who won a senior thesis short film project, and the California State Northridge funded his entire project. So we did this in 2021 during the pandemic, and if you see the QR code, you can take your phone out, and that short film is now released. Someone has it. And it's about 16 minutes, really good. And as far as we know, that is the first film to be scripted and filmed in Modoc language. So this is very exciting. Take the time to get that QR code before I move on. So a big part of this is a film that's already been scripted clearly. It's already won a contest. It already has these consultants and it has a budget, right? And I got reached out to one day just saying, well, we know you're doing language and you've been doing this for a while. Is there any chance that you can work with us on this? I was like, I don't know. That's not really what I do from my linguist brain, right? And so I said I could talk with the director and see what we could figure out. And what we ended up doing was setting up a whole process for getting our script down in a way that's accountable to both of us, our community, and our consultants, right? So when I was given this, I said, give me all of the scripts, every single line you're gonna want me to translate. Once you've done that, I need you to tell me what it does in the scene, right? So when it says he left, I need to say character exit so I can imagine someone walking away, right? Because I need to have something going on in here before I can really get anything out here, right? Or even out of books. Once I did that, I could turn the full linguist brain on and do the 4-line gloss, give them, the phrase I had. We said several phrases, gave them it auditory so they can decide, does this sound different enough from English? Which is what everyone's always looking for, right? Luckily, we have a free word order, so I can just say the same thing 5 different ways. One of them's gonna sound pretty good, right? That's the best. So once we figure out which one sounds right for what we're trying to do, I give them the options, then we'll break those down word for word, piece by piece, right? So for Gena Honk, which seems really short in line, you have this big old breakdown where you have to know that someone's walking away from the speaker, right? And so once you get that down, you get these pieces on that one with the single quotations. This is my free translation as an English speaker from my small town of Chiloquin, Oregon, right? This is not how y'all speak English, this is how I speak. And so with that free translation, I can give them every piece that I have as a linguist, plus what I would say as a person from my hometown, so that when they're working with their subtitling crew and post-production, they can look at all of these and have some sense of accountability when they choose their subtitle. Sometimes it's the original line, sometimes it's a translation, sometimes it's actually, they'll change it to mean the idiom of the translation, which is really cool. And so that was really important because when I'm gonna do something that brings our language out to the world from our space, when we're trying to get a hold of it ourselves, this becomes really high stakes, right? Because it's gonna become permanent once it's filmed. The best part is knowing that this translation was going to motivate people to be out on our lands in, like this picture from the lava beds, right, where we've actually fought against the United States Army, where we're bringing language back to places where it hasn't been spoken or been supported in over 150 years. So here we have 2 of the actors get ready doing an opening scene. You'll see that in the film. We go into the caves. There's over 800 caves in the lava beds. Many of them haven't been mapped out. And that's a place that our people used to be in. And so we were actually in those caves using light boxes, creating false fires. And it's a wild thing as a linguist to see, where I'm used to just trying to set up, document. Everyone's got special effects. That's not the naturalistic look that linguists tend to go for, right? When we were doing some of these scenes, what was interesting and a little bit of irony in here is that none of the speaking actors were Klamath Modoc tribal members. Because this was a fully funded film, it needed to be Screen Actors Guild actors, right? And no one in our tribe at this time is a Screen Actors Guild actor. So we have many Indigenous identifying Screen Actors Guild actors, and we had Klamath tribal community members come in as extras. And so this scene is just a moment. You'll miss it if you blink when you're watching the film. And I love this scene because you see 2 tribal members here, the 2 men on here, the left and the right, and the man on the right is my language mentor, who I did not expect to be there on that day, who I did not know was gonna be part of these, very exciting and very terrifying, right? And so I walk up to him, I show him the script and things like that. He just kind of brushes it away. It's like, thanks for the job, man. Because we don't get paid to do language. There's no way to support yourself through language work generally, right? And so when you see that scene, just, that's my mentor, shout out Harold Wright. And another part of this, as we're getting into these scenes where it gets, real heavy, because this scene only has, this movie has one ending, and that's our people being removed, right? So it's not spoilers. But when we're getting into these spots, we can actually deal with some of the feeling of what that must have been like. And in this scene, there's also a fun part, because you see how there's a little shelf on the right, and then there's like a little rock on the shelf. I'm actually hiding behind that rock in the shadows, right? Because I have to be close enough to coach in language to be like, do it again. Like, but we're all wearing masks because it's also COVID in caves, right? So one of the funnest experiences to be able to make it such that a translation coming from outside of our community is working with people in our community, connecting with people who are working on language within our community, and putting that on film in a format that we can't afford or have the setup to do, and bring that all across the country. So now this short film has shown in New York City, is shown in Sedona, Arizona at Western competitions, is shown in our own hometown. And before the SAG-AFTRA strike, there was talk of potential feature film or a short limited series, but we don't know where that'll go. But this is an opportunity where I find translation is a way that we can really motivate people to use our language and be exposed to it in a way that's accountable to our community. So I want to thank all the actors who are part of that. I want to thank y'all for being here to listen to some of this exercise. So most of Getcha.
Thanks so much, Joe. So we're at the last speaker for this panel, and that's Josh Babcock, my colleague in the Anthropology Department at Brown University. And his talk is entitled, What is the Multi of Multilingualism? What is the Lingualism? Josh?
All right. Hello, everyone. I am very excited to be here and pleased and honored to be included in such an incredible group of folks coming from so many different areas. As I was preparing for this talk, I actually had no idea what I should plan to say or do, just because this is a far more diverse audience than I ever have the pleasure and privilege of speaking to. So rather than trying to cover all of the possibilities, I picked a possibility. And if I pick the wrong possibility for you, I will be excited to chat with all of you later on throughout the day. During the Q&A and the time that we'll have at the end of this panel, and then just to hear more about what it is that you're working on and how that does or does not relate to the things that I might have said in the talk, or also the things that I did say. I will also say, by way of a caveat, I did not design this to be presented from Google Slides, and so I know that the layout is going to look wrong. Just know that I made it look much prettier, and the animations might also not work. That is on me. I could have designed in Google Slides, and I did not. So this is, speaking of translation, here we are. All right, so the title of the talk today that I have given is, or that I've prepared is, What is the Multi of Multilingualism? What is the Lingualism? Where when I was first invited to be part of this, I made my own signature move, which I totally did not invent. Like, I did not invent deconstructivism or iconoclasm, but I immediately took apart the two aspects of this word that was presented to me as the theme of the panel on which I was going to be presenting. What exactly is multi about multilingualism? And what is the second part? What is the language or the lingualism of multilingualism as well? What I did not include in this title is something that anthropologists will often do, where I then was very pleased to see that I'm in good company where no one else on my panel did this either. But the part that would typically follow would be in Singapore. So what is the multi of multilingualism? What is the lingualism in Singapore? To situate what I'm going to talk about today in the context of my broader research, which I'm in the process of developing for my first book, and a few other projects that I'm taking bits and pieces out of that I'm going to talk about in a relatively non-specific way, at least in what I have prepared to share on these slides. What I'm focusing on is about language, race, and technology in constructing the image of Singapore. So when I say the image of Singapore, I'm not talking about visual images exclusively, although visual images are often part of how people come to understand and know and recognize the image of Singapore when they see it or encounter it in other media. But when I say the image of Singapore, I'm thinking about things, for example, like global Singapore, multilingual Singapore, multiracial Singapore, multicultural Singapore, multireligious Singapore, and so forth. These are all examples of dominant images of Singapore that circulate, where even though it might seem that some of them focus more explicitly on language or race, part of what I track in my work is the ways that language and race always come together to co-constitute each and every one of these available images of Singapore, with technology as an important mediating factor or entity that contributes to and participates in the production of these images as well, and vice versa. The technology gets mediated by constructions of race and language also. When people talk about language in Singapore, when I introduce the idea of language in Singapore, I often have to have at least a little bit of mention of the official answer to what are the languages of Singapore. Some of the languages in Singapore are, first of all, Singlish or Singaporean colloquial English, which is a major focus of my research. Also English or Standard English, and then the mother tongue languages of each of the officially recognized races of Singapore. And that is a local term. That is not my imposition for saying that there are races in Singapore. This is a category system that has been that was initially put in place during the British colonial period that has continued as a technology of post-independence statecraft, but haha, the two go together. This is the one that's going to be the most messed up, so I'm sorry that you're not really going to be able to read these, but there are 4 official races in Singapore that comprise what is known as the CMIO model: Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other. Each of these official races then maps onto both linguistic and majority-minority dynamics as well, where Chinese comprises 76% of the population and has Mandarin as their official mother tongue. The Malay group is 15% of the population, has Malay or Bahasa Melayu as their mother tongue. Indian has 8% and has Tamil as the mother tongue, although there are other both officially recognized available South Asian languages that are spoken, and then other South Asian languages that are spoken by members of the officially Indian community that don't fit into either Tamil or the 5 other recognized South Asian languages. And then, of course, other, which is approximately 1% of the population that doesn't have an official mother tongue or that can have various different ways or strategies for getting assigned a mother tongue, especially in the context of official state-led education. And even with a structure that includes other as an available official category, there are lots of languages that do not get represented in this set that I've shown you. There are many, many, many other languages, other languages, that actually are spoken in Singapore that get categorized in various ways as immigrant languages, as foreign languages, as minority languages, and so forth, that are not officially recognized in some way by state institutional apparatuses like education, but are still spoken in the island city-state. What people tend to agree is that whatever else might be used to define the image of Singapore, there's one language in particular, Singlish, that is uniquely Singaporean. I'll get to that asterisk later. But Singlish is uniquely Singaporean. However, this raises many, many questions. What is Singlish? Singlish has been called everything from a wacky sing-song Creole, a hybrid language, a nativized variety of English, the Singapore English dialect, a Creoloid basilect in a polyglossic speech continuum, Singaporean slang, a potent blend of all the languages of Singapore, broken English, and a handicap we must not wish on Singaporeans by the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, and Chinese grammar with words from English/Malay and Chinese dialects slotted in. And this is a common view that I have not attributed to any particular person because it is something that is in widespread use among members of the Singaporean polity, whether or not they're Singaporean. This also comes with another, this brings me back to the asterisk. So let's not forget about Manglish or Malaysian English. So Singlish is uniquely Singaporean, but for anyone who is familiar with the history of Singapore and Malaysia, and also with the varieties of English that are spoken there, there's actually not a firm line in most cases between things that get called Singlish or Singaporean colloquial English and Manglish or Malaysian English. Part of why I outline all of that is not to say that Singlish is actually a fake thing that doesn't exist. It's to point out that it is always already a field of contestation where no one really quite has the same idea of what it is beyond the fact that it is uniquely Singaporean. Part of this, of course, has to do with histories for what I've called sensing, citing, and citing Singlish, with a little bit of wordplay thrown in, where in the 1980s, this author, who is actually a cartoonist, Sylvia To Paik Tu, wrote a book about what she called pasapatois. So she doesn't actually use the term Singlish in this book to describe the language of Singapore and Malaysia. For those who have not had a chance to, or the pleasure of enjoying this book, if you look at it, you actually see that many of the forms that now are claimed as uniquely Singaporean, as Singlish items, showed up in this book too, when it was explicitly connected to the language that was being spoken in Singapore and Malaysia. We also have our good friends, the linguists, where the Australian linguist John Platt published a piece in 1975 that is often credited as the first scientific description of Singlish, or Singaporean colloquial English, although he included very few examples of the kinds of forms that people were using or calling Singlish. He instead was much more interested in, again, this lectal continuum model, where he was borrowing from Fergusonian diglossia to describe the case of Arabic and saying that this might actually be a really good model for describing something like Singlish. This is the diagram that he came up with. And it was, of course, the linguist's official representation, the 1975 version, that continued into public consciousness and that continues to inform the ways that Singlish is thought about and talked about today. That also inaugurated a whole tradition of relying on linguists' authority in constructing authoritative representations of Singlish, whether or not those are the most proximal citation or whether those are something that has a deeper genealogy that's been layered over by other kinds of popular representations, media representations, and so forth. This gives rise in 2016 to things like this was the winner of a competition for the Singapore Linguistic Diversity Challenge, where they gave this sentence. The challenge was to include all the languages of Singapore in a single sentence. That actually works grammatically. This is an example. This technically works. In Singapore, Singaporeans might know that no one would say this. Or if you would say this, it would be in a very, very particular kind of context where each of these items points to a specific kind of available social relation, a social identity. I mean, I'm not going to get into this because this is in fact a whole paper, so I'm not going to talk about it now. But no one would really say this, but they might. And then, of course, you have versions of these representations that focus on the distinction between Singlish versus English that rely on these histories or these chains of citation in order to construct a very sharp distinction between Singlish now versus English, where I don't have an image of the inside of this book, and I thought about bringing it with me, but they actually have the side-by-side facing translation, where on one side you have Singlish and the other side you have Singlish and English, with the design being set up to suggest that Singlish is actually better than English, but with a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, haha, but we know we still have to speak both. All right, so remember this 2016 version, the thing that nobody really would say. Part of what ends up happening in all of these discursive constructions of Singlish by authoritative, especially state-linked actors, is that Singlish gets presented, and here's the connection that I made to this conference, Singlish is presented and constructed as always in need of translation. Translation for specific kinds of audiences, for specific kinds of listeners or overhearers, where you end up having situations like this one, where this was a long-running column in the Straits Times, Singapore's official state-run media outlet, that actually continues into the present, although now it's digital, where you have a column from people who write in with questions about whether or not a particular usage is Singlish, where the person who is imagined, and I'm sorry that I don't have time to get into this, but I'm happy to talk more about it later, the person who is imagined as encountering the problem of Singlish is a foreigner. The foreigner who doesn't understand. The foreigner who does not understand and therefore requires translation in order to get from something that is unclear to something that is clear. Where often here, as you can see in the answer that was given by the expert, the thing that they're suggesting you say is not, have you taken your lunch? It's, have you had your lunch? And this is clearer, not clearer to a foreigner or a specific kind of foreigner, it's clearer in general. Raises many questions that you may or may not be able to see. For whom is this a translation? What is actually translated? What other alternates are available and is the act of eating actually important? Where I'm showing all of this again because these are other available alternates that people might also use in place of the have you taken your lunch sentence, or phrased within a larger construction, where all of these both convey the similar kind of sense of have you eaten food, but also convey other things as well. So part of why I put this list here is because it looks obviously different, right? These are obviously different both in terms of the orthographies that I've selected, in terms of the actual constructions themselves, but all of these are things that I have encountered in my fieldwork as being called Singlish in some way, which I think people would be very surprised to hear that, again, whether or not you are from Singapore, but I can talk more again about why and how people attributed each of these as examples of Singlish within other kinds of constructions. So rarely on their own, but sometimes on their own. So which of these are Singlish, if any, when, for whom, and in terms of what? Where the answers to each of these often point beyond the semantics, so beyond the meaning of the words and the forms, to point to things about the social context. For example, what do we know about each other? To indicate that I care about you or want to establish solidarity with you. It's not really about have you eaten, it's about establishing a certain kind of social relation. And when you translate it as have you eaten or have you had your lunch, focusing on the act of consuming food, that misses these other aspects of social context and participant roles, contexts of use, etymological sources, and so forth that people also are focusing on in trying to understand what this thing is. So what I'm going to, basically the TLDR is, translation is an everyday ethnographic concern for me. It's not just an expert technical or professional analytic domain. That part of the question is what counts as the languages between or among which translation happens, and what does translation do or accomplish? But this isn't just my question, this is also the question that interlocutors with whom I engaged in Singapore are constantly being forced to navigate as well, that this is their question too. So part of what I'm invested in doing is refusing to privilege my own and others' expert or professional answers, where this is a dominant strategy in Singapore, is to rely on the linguists. What I want to be able to do is to say that it's not about speaking as an expert or a professional to say when and how, in fact, translation has or has not occurred, which languages are or are not present, is this or is this not Singlish, but to really understand how Singlish is always a problem for which translation is the solution. But we then need to understand how each component of that opens a whole problematic rather than being a conclusion. It's a starting point rather than a conclusion. So I will stop here, and I look forward to hearing from all of you soon.
Thank you very much, Josh. With that, we've come to the end of the papers. Thank you. Those are the 4 papers that we'll be discussing. I'm going to maybe give the panel a few minutes to see if they want to respond to each other or pose each other any questions, and then we'll open this to the audience. So the 4 of you, were there any comments and questions we want to take first before I open this up?
I do have a question.
Go ahead, Josh.
Is this on? Testing. I was very curious about, so I noticed the category of lengua madre, mother tongue, show up in the quote that you gave. Mother tongue is another, as you all saw, an area that I have to think quite a bit about. So I was curious to hear more from Paja specifically about how this category of mother tongue fits in relation to indigenous languages, just because I don't often see that category applied in a North American context to think about indigenous languages. And so this also then invites our good friend Joe Dupree to weigh in if there's anything, reflections or thoughts that he would like to share.
Do you want to start or should I? Okay, you can hear me okay? So it comes from a couple places. So one is that, that campaign to do memes in indigenous languages came from a particular campaign for International Mother Tongue Day, right? Which is a UNESCO thing, right? So it was Mexico's, these digital activists I've been working with, their response to that larger sort of day, right? So that's one place that it comes from. But it's also very widely mobilized in Mexico too. Mi madre, mi lengua materna, that's sort of a discourse. And in fact, one of the few authors that I've ever interviewed that will come anywhere near admitting to kind of the true kind of bilingualism that would be at odds with the kind of ideology that Victor Turan sort of addressed, was like, my mother tongues are Spanish and Mazatec because I learned Spanish and Mazatec from my mother. But he's like, which doesn't quite, sort of admit to the kinds of things I was sort of speaking to as the messy realities, but it does because it still leaves the kind of weightedness sort of intact, even though it sort of says that for me, these languages are equally, they're on parity for me, and I both learned them from my mother. But that's interesting. I really never thought about that it's sort of not as widely used in North America, because it is, I would say, pretty widely used in Mexico. Do you want to add anything, Joe?
Hello. Yes. So the big thing that I've noticed is it doesn't show up in North America a lot, but I think that has a lot to do with the categorization of Indian peoples, right? And it has a lot to do with like the Bureau of American Ethnology and things like that, and you could probably speak to this, especially with choosing what a discrete language is, right? Because determining who was who in Indian country usually was, an ethnologist along with, geologists and soldiers, and they're like, oh, these guys sound alike. Like you run a circle around them and you see how they act toward other people who sound like or do not like them, right? And then when it came to the reservation period, a big idea was to group people who were either conflicting or could be peaceable and managed, right? And so when it comes to mother tongue, it's like you're already kind of grouped accordingly. And in our case, we have Klamath, Modoc, which are like our own kind of family set with Paiutes as well, because they're hoping for antagonism, right? But that relies on lots of European ideologies about language that have nothing to do with ours. And so with lots of natives that I know, all of our languages are all like, there's no concept of mother language. It's like you have all those that you work with and those that you're a part of, right? It's kind of like, I'm from multiple tribes, but I have a home despite having different homelands as well, right? And then do you have thoughts on that matter of discrete languages and classifying and categorizing would be helpful?
Well, just a little bit. So I've worked about 10 years up through about 2016 in Alaska with indigenous language reclamation and revitalization. And so in many languages, I think indigenous languages in particular, there isn't necessarily an endonym or exonym for the language. I mean, it's talking or the way of being a person, or something, right? Depending on the language, of course, in the community. And I think this is a pretty serious idea, that the notion, the category of language is in fact an invention. And I'm not saying it's uniquely Euro-American or what have you, but it is an invention. And it is something that actually has implications and repercussions in terms of how we evaluate and judge, engage in bias or inclusion with people who speak various categorical descriptors of a communicative repertoire, right? So I think that in the Indigenous context, I mean, I know from colleagues, if I can use the word, but I'm speaking quote unquote Indian, I've heard this quite a bit. It isn't about the named language. It's about a semiotic repertoire that has cultural roots and community relevance that isn't necessarily nominalized and labeled in the same way that we do in so many other languages, which I would argue again is an outgrowth of this kind of meta-discursive regime emerging out of Europe and colonialism in particular, but also elsewhere in the world earlier, if you're interested, in India and some of the Sanskrit grammarians, for example, but that's a separate issue. So.
And sort of following on that, one of the things I'm finding is that when it comes to things coming from language from UNESCO especially, tribes in the United States seem to be the last to find out because we don't have a direct connection. We're supposed to have one government connect 500 plus tribes like through all that and inform us. We even told about the International Year of Indigenous Languages. That's why we have a decade to start now. And so with Mother Language Day, it's like I had to learn about that after becoming a linguist, after going to the University of Arizona, after doing all these sorts of things to find out that people around the world are doing this, but that's because they have a direct plug-in to the UN, right? Tribal nations in the United States don't have that. And so like I wonder how that goes in Singapore. How does that work out?
We have a few minutes left. Why don't we take some questions from the audience, if that's okay? If you raise your hand, my colleague Jane Sokolowski will get you a mic. Marco Fiedler? Jane?
Thank you so much. I really...
It's on. Hello?
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for all your presentations. I totally agree with the non-reification of languages. I think that was really important, non-reification of languages. And I have a question, a very naive question. I'm a linguist, but I'm actually like asking this very naive question. When indigenous people with different languages, Paja and other people, they speak, let's say they're bilingual or trilingual, and they communicate with the monolingual people or some other people from the indigenous groups with Spanish or English. What does this do to, like, when you have your sort of indigenous background and the language and culture, and how does this affect the way you actually do the linguistic behavior in the English or Spanish? Do we have any studies on this aspect? Because I think the behavior would be very different. Like, you know, there was a case in Australia about the woman who actually sort of, you know, allegedly killed her partner, and it turned out that she was speaking English, but her culture and indigenous culture actually sort of prevented her from speaking out about the circumstances, and then later on she was out and she was granted she was not I think she came out, but so when you have another language, sort of like a language of the majority, what does your sort of like the indigenous language do to your, or the other language do to the interaction between the two languages? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so. I'm just struggling with the different ways I could answer it, I suppose. I mean, if you're asking how it affects behavior to be bilingual, I'm not sure I can answer that question, but sorry.
linguistic behavior.
Linguistic behavior. I mean, so there are so many different ways I could sort of say there's an interaction. So one is sort of the existence of loan words that operate back and forth, right? Often without being salient to the consciousness of speakers, right? It's sort of like the habits are ones that are sort of, the languages are being mixed up all the time, and only sometimes they're recognized as being mixed up, and sometimes not. I think another way that it affects, I mean, like if I look just at the poems for just a minute, I mean, I will say when I've interviewed speakers who are not themselves authors but read the work of Indigenous authors, they will sometimes say, this Zapotec or whatever it is, like, it's just really messed up by Spanish, right? I mean, sort of like it feels like it's being skewed by the presence of Spanish, and also vice versa. So some of the activist translators I'm talking about, some of them tell me that one of the things that they're doing when they impoverish the Spanish is to kind of indigenize it, right? I mean, just sort of like shift the language in subtle ways that bring it closer to the indigenous language and therefore make it seem more false, more foreign, more incompetent at some level as a speaker, right? Those are two different things that I can think of. I mean, I think, in terms of the practice of what it's like to be bilingual and operate in this kind of bilingual context, I mean, I think one of the things that happens all the time is that people actually don't, and like in my experience, people don't actually observe this kind of compartmentalization that the explicit ideology would have you believe. Like, so the question, like I would say, my experience is that translation is absolutely, an emic question for people as well, but only sometimes, because sometimes the point is not which code you're speaking in. The point is just like you're speaking and you're communicating, and it's only kind of from the perspective of an ideology of purism, which lots of Indigenous authors have. You're supposed to keep these things separate, right? I mean, so to give you one of the well-known Mazatec author who is always trying to get people to stop using loans, right? So he comes up with all these neologisms to substitute for loans. Like, so cafe is one that's common in this coffee-producing region. People drink coffee 10 times a day. People use coffee all the time. And his substitution is not cafe, but dachan, which is like brown water. And he's been trying for like 3 decades to get people to use that word instead of coffee, and just like, good luck to him. People are just not going to do it, right? Because like for him, what's so weird, for them, what's so weird and foreign is the weird loan, because most of the people don't even recognize it as a loan. It's just like, that's the word you use for the thing that you're going to drink at night before you go to bed. That's a complicated answer, and there's probably other ways I could answer, but maybe I'll let other people jump in as well.
We do have another question here from Shazad.
Thank you. So this was a really wonderful panel. Just thinking about the complexity of, in a way, the problem being that the category language and its technical usages in the academy don't actually correspond to the world that we encounter. And the 4 of your papers do this in a wonderful way, from 4 different directions. So as I was listening to it, it seemed to me to be very parallel with the question of history that I've been working on extensively. And part of the problem is with the very word history and what it brings up and its colonial encounters and so on. So there seems to be a parallel with the notion of language that is working together. Now, one of the ways in which people have tried to get away from history is to talk about the past. So to use a different word that encompasses history as it's come to be known, but actually makes it much more expansive. So there are many different ways of thinking about the past that may or may not correspond to what we may call history and so on. So there's a different thematization of time by going to an alternative word and its conceptual basis. So I'm wondering if there's a movement like that in the study of language, in the linguistics, linguistic anthropology, or pragmatics, as in the case of Modoc, where there's a way to like escape this cage within which we are bound academically.
Just a small note on that. There's a group in linguistics, a special interest group with the Linguistic Society of America, Natives for Linguistics, that specifically focuses on that. But instead of going after the word language, we go after the word linguistics in terms of looking at it in the narrow sense of like, this is what linguistics is, and looking to language work more broadly, including research, advocacy, teaching, resource development, et cetera, as part of that broader repertoire of like what we're, for now, Wesley Leonard calls a little L linguistics. So I use the term language research broadly, but in terms of language itself, not yet.
we have a couple of other questions here. So Kevin, and then in the middle aisle we have two.
Thanks, Edon. Yeah. I wanted to ask, I mean, obviously, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that language is an artificial category that makes something seem much purer than it actually is in the world. On the other hand, it seems to me that the politics of that observation can cut in the other direction to the extent that languages are not defined. Sometimes they're also threatened. And we have, obvious situations around the world where governments or people who speak a language that's not the dominant language in the country that they live in declare themselves to have a language and that it's imperiled. And so I wondered if you could just speak to that in all of the contexts that you're working in, because it does seem, complicated. Think of Quebec, for example, where there's a kind of insistence on the purity of French and that everything needs to be in French. English words need to be kept out. And, there are obviously political reasons for that. And I wondered if you could speak to that in your different contexts.
I could start. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I mean, I would say that the entire endeavor of creating a literature in Indigenous languages is premised on the idea that it's about bolstering a language as a language, elevating its status, circumscribing it as a particular entity that particular group of people have and speak precisely in order to leverage it for political visibility, for political power, et cetera. So, I mean, some of the strongest people who espouse the reality of languages, Indigenous languages, are precisely the kinds of people that I was talking about, who are Indigenous authors, right? So absolutely. I mean, and indeed, it's not just like it's a language and it has bounded and it has, grammatical regularity and it has all this kind of status, but also like all these different, in the case of say Mazatec, a language I've written about a lot, all these different variants of this one language that are not mutually intelligible are still the same language. Because we're still the part of the same ethnicity, because that is part of what allows you to leverage the government for resources, for power, for standing, even for the kind of visibility that would say our language is in danger, so help us protect it. So there's absolutely a kind of like risk and a reality of sort of like falling down the kind of like slippery slope of the fuzziness of language that many of the Indigenous authors I work with and actors would absolutely 100% reject, right?
So since we're running up against time here, how about we collect the last two questions, get some brief responses, and then we're gonna break, I think. Oh, just one more question then.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much. It was really, really great session. I have a question to Stephen. I work at the Data Science Institute and Center for Computational Biology, and we have a lot of students from various countries, various backgrounds, a lot of languages. And as a PI on the project, I wanted to ask you what would be good first steps on identifying biases in our community, and how can we make the space more inclusive?
Thank you for the wonderful question. It articulates just a little bit with Kevin's question as well. I mean, so the issue is the presumed homogeneity of speech communities or of linguistic varieties, as we would say in linguistics, as you know, or just simply the human capacity for the recombinatory use of semiotic resources to do talk. Right? So deciding where those borders are, including and excluding different heterogeneous elements that might be in some senses considered within that communicative framework. Named languages, for example, why are Hindi and Urdu considered named languages? It's because of nation state and religious affiliation and all of this. I speak both of those languages. I've taught both those languages at university. There's a 60 or 70% overlap minimally in vocabulary, as much as 80 or 90% if you look at the quotidian everyday uses of those two languages in social contexts, including the mixing in of other languages, primarily English because of colonial reasons. So when you start looking on the ground at what is actually happening in the process ontology of communication at a moment in time as you gather data, that is only partly represented, and sometimes there are dynamics of erasure or marginalization as that thing becomes this reified object of a named language. Now, I'm not saying that names aren't helpful. They are. And they can also be political projects. So naming a language can actually give you political purchase for lobbying, for activism, for a sense of galvanizing an identity that is related to a particular semiotic repertoire. These are all very important. And on the other hand, they also potentially invoke a poor word-to-world fit. As Century McConey, my colleague when I was at Penn State, described it, languages, invented languages, in desperate need of speakers. And so there is that piece, right? Where do you draw the line? It's just like drawing an isogloss line, when you have one feature on one side of it and another feature on the other side, right, that share some sort of distribution. I mean, in some ways it might really hold up. In other ways, people are so mobile now. How are isogloss lines even useful as we think about the mobility and the deterritorialized use of multiple media in everyday communicative action and these sorts of things? So I guess my point is just let's not confuse the reified category with the process ontology reality of language use. And I think that's the key point for me, is just being more critically aware. It isn't that we can't use those labels. It's that we just should be aware that we're not talking about intrinsic reality, whatever that is, right? We're talking about a category that represents or labels that reality. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So,
Thank you. I think we do have to break here, so please join me in thanking our panelists.